Welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon to discuss ECERS-3 data analysis. I'll just give people a moment to arrive and then we'll kick things off. So again, welcome. It's such a pleasure to have so many participants here this afternoon for this webinar. We so appreciate you taking time out of your days to spend part of the afternoon here with us. So on behalf of Teachers College Press, the publisher of the Environment Rating Scale family of products, including the new book, A Guide to Analyzing and Interpreting ECERS-3 Data, which will be the focus of this afternoon's conversation, welcome and thank you for being here. I'm going to turn it over to our panelists as quickly as possible so we can dig in on the data this afternoon. So just some housekeeping matters very briefly. Please be aware this webinar is being recorded. Once the video is processed, a link will be sent to all registrants. Please feel free to share this with colleagues who are unable to be here but might benefit from this afternoon's discussion. Our presentation will run an hour, followed by a 15-minute Q&A period. If you have questions, please submit them using your chat panel, and our panelists will do their best to get to those at the end of our time. Finally, there's a discount available on the book, A Guide to Analyzing and Interpreting ECERS-3 Data, available exclusively to the attendees of this webinar when you purchase directly through Teachers College Press. Please look for the code for that discount in your chat panel and in the follow-up email that you'll receive in a few days. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to our panelists, and please welcome Noreen Yazejian.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm Noreen Yazejian. I am a senior research scientist at Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute, and I'm very happy to be here. This is a picture of me. This is my pandemic hair in this picture on the screen. So I noticed that as Emily was talking. So I'm going to turn it over, pass it to Juan for an introduction.
Hi, everyone. My name is Won Kyung Jang. I'm an assistant professor in the Janine Rainbolt College of Education at the University of Oklahoma, specializing in early care and education and data science. Nice to meet you all.
Dory?
Hi, my name is Dari Jagdisuran. I graduated from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I currently live in Starkville, Mississippi. I have taught at Mississippi State University, and I've been raising my toddler son.
And I'm Dick Clifford. I'm one of the authors of the scale, and I'm really delighted to be here today. I'm the authors of one of the scales, the three primary scales, and also the author of the book, one of the authors of the book. So we're delighted to have a chance to share work we've been doing recently to make our underlying concept of quality more transparent and to present new ways of looking at data from ECERS-3. That will also be, this should also be applicable to use of the other scales. Noreen and I have been exceptionally fortunate to have worked with two former colleagues and doctoral candidates at UNC and FPG. FPG is Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute. Juan Zhang, who introduced himself, is then at the University of Oklahoma, and Dari Jagdisuran is in Mississippi. We hope that you'll have a chance to meet them in this process of hearing these presentations, and perhaps maybe you will call on them to help you with what you're doing with the rating scales in your state. They've helped us deepen our understanding of what quality means and to bring new statistical tools to explore what we find when using the scales in the field. We're going to, after we each do our presentations, we're going to end up with a Q&A session at the end, as Emily mentioned. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction about how we see children's development and how early childhood programs and the larger environment impact their growth. Dari will then present information from a large-scale study of ECERS-3 showing what was found about these programs. Then Juan will present some new, more advanced analytic methods to help us better understand how the ECERS-3 works in the real world. Noreen will talk about implications of what we found about early childhood programs and factors that influence early childhood program quality. And then, as I said, we'll end with a Q&A. Today, we're going to be focusing on the third edition of ECERS. You may or may not know that it was first published in 1980. So I've been working on this for most of my career. I hate to tell you that I was not that young when we did this, but for more than 40 years working on this. And this third edition is the latest update of the edition. It's designed to help professionals in the field using the scales for professional development, for evaluation, and for research. The concepts presented here will also apply to ECERS and FICRS. Said that already. So now, why do we do this book? How do children learn? How do we define quality? How do we measure quality? How can we use data from ECERS-3 to further our understanding of how well we are doing to help us continuously improve quality? While we have not used any single theory of learning to write the ECERS, we do have guiding principles based on a long tradition of theories about how children develop. We will talk a little about these theories that were most important to us in our conceptual model of how we can change things to improve the provision of learning environments for young children. We'll also strive to provide guidance on the actual analysis of data and on interpreting the findings and using large data set collected as part of the ECERS-3 evaluation. First, we have a theory of change, and this theory relies on four basic parts. This is theory of change for learning environments. So there are inputs. So in the classroom, into classrooms. For instance, the number of teachers there, the amount of training they have, the materials that they have to work for. All of these things are inputs into classrooms. And secondly, the middle part, the set of processes, that is this, and the processes are what we call classroom quality. You see the box in the middle there that's labeled throughputs and processes. That's the early childhood learning environment in the classroom. And you'll see the things we measure there: space and furnishings, personal care routines, language and literacy, learning activities, interaction, and program structure. So you'll recognize those as those of you familiar with the rating scale. It looks like most of you are. You'll see those are the 6 subscales of this instrument. But those inputs and throughputs also are influenced by these inputs over on the left-hand side, ranging from things that are very close to us, the family characteristics of family we're serving, the access to services in the community that are available, the early care and education system that people have available, and of course, the teachers. And more distant from that, but still that has an influence, both direct and indirect, is what is called the exosystem here, the political environment, federal and state laws and regulations, the media, education systems, funding systems, neighborhood environments, social services, etc. And finally, at the very largest scale is our world and the cultural beliefs and social norms in our world, the human rights, political structure of our world, the economy, and the world environment, both the physical environment and the human environment. So all of those things affect early childhood programs. Then the early childhood programs affect the children, and they affect children's academic development, math, science, language, and literacy, social emotional skills, health and safety, etc. And those outputs then are not the final goal. the final goal is what we call outcomes, and it's related to the education level of people in our society, the general health of people, the social emotional qualities of people in our environment, the economic status of people, and individual achievements. So this model basically has been researched and found to be accurate. I think from in our own house, Craig Ramey and his colleagues ran a project called the Yazejian project that started looking at children when they were born, actually identified families before the children were born, and then they provided high quality service to them and to a match group that did not get those services. And they compared how well those kids did in early childhood programs, but actually they're still following those kids now. And that was started in the 1970s. So all of these kids now are adults, and they've continued to find an impact of early childhood programs on kids during this entire time. The nature of those impacts varies over time. Then this next chart is Urie Bronfenbrenner at Cornell at the time actually put this in what he called his theory of change for children. And he focused on the child and how those things outside the child influence the child and influence each other to influence the child. I'm not going to talk too much more about that, but Urie Bronfenbrenner has been a major force in understanding children and learning environments. But let me come back, next slide, to how children actually learn. So we talk about the environment has an influence on them, but how do children actually learn? And there are, I spent much of my life trying to figure that out, and people have started long before me. In fact, back in the Greek era, some 2,000 years, more than 2,000 years ago, Aristotle wrote about what he called tabula rasa. That is that children come to us out of the womb as a blank slate, and everything they know, they learn from us. And but over the centuries, that's been modified somewhat. And particularly in my lifetime, there's been this debate between nurture, that is what we do. This is what Aristotle was talking about, how we nurture children, and the nature of children, what they are physically, how they come to us. And the balance between those two, both of those impact how well children do in their learning and in their lives. And it's really the interaction between these things that is critical to children's development. And that's basically the framework that we work from. Okay, next slide. So Vygotsky, I want to talk about in particular. So we talked about this learning framework before, but actually the way children learn, oops, that's Noreen, I think that shouldn't be the next slide. The next one should be the process of learning. Oh, no, that's okay. Yeah. No, it should be just, no, it should be called the process of learning with Lev Vygotsky's name in parentheses. Can you see that? Here you go. Learning occurs in the context of interactions. Lev Vygotsky was a psychologist in the early part of the 1900s, and his work has had a huge impact on our thinking in our world about how children learn. He says, first of all, that all learning occurs in the social context. And we know that from our own experiences. You know that. Learning happens but here's the key. Learning happens when we're faced with some type of crisis. And he says all learning is that way. That the crisis can't be so great that the crisis overcomes us or our children as they're learning, but it only happens when the difficulty is just right, so that there's a balance about how difficult it is and what children currently know. So it's not too easy for them, but it's not overcoming. The challenge is not overcoming. When a child can't reach an object, she looks for a solution. She may look to the teacher to help her get the object, to help her figure out a way to get the object. She may ask another child. She may herself explore and get a stool and stand on that to try to reach the thing on the shelf. I mean, I want her to do that, but she's likely to try that. It's resolving the crisis at that process of how the child reacts to this challenge that is a learning. That's how learning occurs. It's in the doing that the learning occurs. Okay, now can you go to the next one? Okay, thanks. Vygotsky learned what he called the zone of proximal development. You may well have heard of this. I've heard this in my studies in graduate school. And this is the same thing I was talking about before, that some crises are too hard to overcome. But if the task called for is within her reach, then she will learn. The concept of doing that, to mastering that task. The concept of scaffolding, you may be more familiar with, and it's talked about a lot today. And it is finding the right balance between the risk or difficulty and the readiness of a child to make the leap, to learn a word, to count a number, to draw a picture, or to learn other life skills. It's these challenges that they have. And this is the very heart of learning. The task that we're talking about here could be presented by teachers, by parents, or actually most often, they appear naturally to children as they go through life, as they are exploring things, as they're trying new events. That may be in play or exploration, but in their whole lives, in our whole lives. And excuse me, you can go to the next one. What do we mean by quality? What we mean, I wanted to say one more thing, sorry, about Vygotsky. This idea of the challenge that children face and overcoming that, being the learning that happens, is also borne out in other parts of life. Scientists have found that trees, for instance, when trees experience hard winds, that's the time the roots of trees grow the most. The trees are, in essence, learning how to cope with strong winds, and they do this by changing the nature of the plant. So this concept of stress and learning is universal. Okay, now, what do we mean by the term quality? What we really mean is what children experience in a center-based early childhood program. That's what we're focusing on today, or it could be family child care or infant toddler program. But we look at this from the point of view of the children. Is it a safe place for me? Am I getting a healthy and nourishing environment experience? Is the environment stimulating cognitively and physically? Do I have the opportunity to develop healthy relationships with other children and with adults? Am I being provided enough guidance and freedom to help me to become independent and self-sufficient? These are all aspects of learning that we look at, and all from the point of view of the child. And then next, based on these principal concepts, we wrote the indicators of quality that form the basis for the entire document, the entire scale, relying, and here's where we got our ideas from. We all have had experience working with young children personally. And we learned through that experience, hopefully, that we are learning in that same way through experience as children are. We understand the theoretical principles that we've described here, and there are a lot more theories out there as well. We rely on research in the field in conducting, particularly in studies using the previous editions of the rating scales. We use standards from major professional organizations, ranging from NAEYC to the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics to the medical side. We get feedback, and from the major professional organizations, I mentioned that. We get feedback from literally thousands of users of previous editions, particularly the ECERS Incorporated, which does training for the rating scales, responds to questions from all over the country. And it is literally thousands upon thousands of questions that they've responded to. And that provides a wealth of information for us in figuring out how to best assess quality. And finally, for the ECERS-3, we put together 2 focus groups that dealt with issues that were of particular concern to us as we did this revision. And that was on the diversity of populations that we're serving and how we serve them, and on needs of children with special needs and how those are met in early environments. And that was a great help to us. But overall, there are literally millions, many millions of things that influence children's development. And what we had to do was we had to pick some that are indicators of that quality of what's going on with children. So next, we developed for the ECERS-3 461 indicators that are indicators of the things we actually measure when we're in the classroom looking at programs. We developed those and organized those into 35 items, with each item containing indicators that range from those representing inadequate practice to minimal practice to acceptable, to good practice, and to excellent practice. And the items are organized into 6 aspects of quality known as the subscales. Finally, the combination of all the items, scores of all the items, are put together to come up with a single score that we think of as total quality. So let's look at one item, encouraging children's use of books. You see those things numbered 1.1, 3.1, 5.1, 7.1 going across the scale. Each of those strands represents some aspect of the environment that we're looking for around children's use of books. And they're grouped with those under the 1 inadequate, you'll see that at the top, and 3 minimal, good, and excellent, as I was describing earlier. And let's go on to the next one, Noreen. So here's how we actually score that. The indicators are always scored either yes or no, or in a few cases, it's possible to give them not applicable. And there are a variety of reasons that can be true. Maybe the children, the age you're looking at in the individual indicator, the age of the child that's of concern there isn't in the room. Secondly, the item scores are calculated by examining the indicator scores. And we go from left to right across that item, as I mentioned. If all of the items under inadequate are scored positively, then you can move on to the next time level, which is minimal. If at least half of those under minimal are scored positively, they can get a 2. If all of them are positive, you can get then a 3. And then you go on to the 4s. And once you've gotten positive answers to all of those first ones, if you score half of those under 5, you get a 4. And if you score all of them, you get a 5. And the same thing with a 7. So that's the basic way that we score items. And the subscales are just an average of the scores that of items scores in that subscale. And the total score is calculated as the average score for all of the items. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dari, who's going to talk about what scores actually look like in real world settings.
Thank you, Dick. So I would like to begin telling a little more about the data used for our analysis. The original data comes from a large-scale ECERS validation study that's begun in 2015 at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and was conducted by Dr. Diane Early. The goal of the study was to explore the psychometric properties of the ECERS-3 and examine alternative scoring techniques. The data were collected through classroom observations in 3 states, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Washington. The identified data sets were shared for our secondary analysis and included 1,369 classrooms. So this table shows classrooms in the sample grouped by program type. As you can see, most classrooms were not in a school building. Of those in the school building, most were not Head Starts. Overall, 298 were in a preK program and 545 classrooms were not in a preK program. Please note that because of the misinformation, 526 classrooms are not shown in the table. So now I would like to introduce some simple statistical terms used to describe and understand data. So measures of central tendency help us find the middle or the average of a data set. Mean is what most people call average. It is the sum of all values divided by the total number of values. And median, simply explained, is the score in the middle if you list all scores in order from low to high. So basically, half of the scores in the list are less or equal to it, and the other half are equal or greater. Variability describes how far apart data points lie from each other and from the center of distribution. Along with the measures of central tendency, measures of variability help us understand and summarize the data. Range is spread of the data from the lowest to the highest value in its distribution. And standard deviation is a measure of how dispersed the data in relation to the mean and is calculated using a specific formula. Low standard deviation means data are clustered around the mean, and high standard deviation indicates data are more spread out. The understanding of shape of data is also crucial. Skewness is a measure of symmetry of distribution, or more precisely, the lack of symmetry. A distribution or data set is symmetric if it looks the same to the left and right of the center point. A distribution can have positive, negative, or zero skewness. Kurtosis is a measure of whether the data are heavy-tailed or light-tailed relative to normal distribution. Kurtosis values close to zero assume normal distribution. Negative values up to -1 indicate light tails, and positive values up to +1 assume heavy tails. So these measures help us compare different areas in our data and see if we are doing better in certain areas and maybe not so great in other areas. So now let's look at our data using the simple descriptive statistics. This table displays 5 highest and lowest scoring items for the sample. The item with the high score is staff-child interaction with a mean of 4.95. It is followed by item number 1, indoor space, item number 31, peer interaction, item 21, individual teaching and learning, and item 13, encouraging the use of language. So these items viewed as relative areas of strength and suggest that classrooms in the sample were particularly strong in meeting children's needs for interpersonal exchanges. And then there are items that scored low. So the item with the lowest score in that sample was item 25, understanding written numbers with a mean 1.73, followed by the next low scoring item, blocks, item 20, math, materials and activities, item 23, nature science, item 22, and gross motor equipment, item 7. So these items viewed as relative areas of need and appear mostly related to science and technology or STEM field. We predict that this might be the area of particular need in early childhood programs. Next slide, please. Thank you. This table shows the means and distribution of the overall ECERS scale and for each subscale. The mean for all observations is 3.63. The subscale with the highest score is interaction, mean 4.38. And the subscale with the lowest score is learning activities, mean 2.94. These scores correspond to what we have learned from item means. Exploring every subscale scores is helpful for understanding, again, where we are doing good and where we are doing not so good. So we could develop plans for remedies. As you can see, the total score and the subscale 1, space and furnishing, and subscale 3, language and literacy, are relatively normally distributed, and the mean is roughly the same as median. In others, the mean differs from the median in the direction of the skewness. For the positively skewed distributions like subscales 2 and 4, the means are pulled to the right, and for the negatively skewed, subscale 5, for example, the mean is pulled to the left. For all subscales, the standard deviation values cluster around 1, which suggests that there is enough difference in the scores in a subscale for improvement. In fact, the range of scores in a subscale is close to the extremes of the scale, which means the sample includes a variety of classrooms with a full range of ECERS-3 scores. This table is just another way to present the subscales. You can see the subscales and which subscales score at high and low relative to each other. And finally, this graph shows the shape of the distribution of ECERS-3 scores in subscales, where the data for each subscale is shown in quartiles. So there is a peak somewhere in the middle and tails on both directions from the peak. So subscales 1 to 4, if you look carefully, they only have one peak, and subscales 5 and 6 have 2 distinct peaks. In terms of skewness, the measure of asymmetry. The subscale 5 is negatively skewed. For subscales 5 and 6, where the kurtoses are below 0 or negative, the distributions show long light tails, indicating smaller outliers. The subscale 4, with kurtoses greater than 0, has heavy tails. Now I'm turning over to Wong so he can talk more in detail about differential statistics.
Thank you so much, Dari. In this part, I will discuss how we made inferences about statistical relationships between variables. Next. The ECERS has the 35 items that are grouped into the 6 conceptual subscales. And we examined how well this original model fits our data. And we used exploratory factor analysis to reduce the 35 items into 7 factors, which demonstrate a better fit for our data compared to the original 6 conceptual subscales. So the 7 empirical subscales consist of indoor space and arrangement, gross motor activities, learning activities, personal care routines, interactions, language and literacy activities, and math activities. Theoretically, the 7-factor model appears to be a reasonable choice because it generates classroom logistics, learning activities, and interaction-related factors, and specifies the domain-specific areas such as language and literacy and math. In particular, this new factor structure highlights 2 aspects of early gross motor and math, and these factors are considered as independent factors rather than big subsummed in other factors. So the factors derived empirically can be useful in examining different aspects of the environment and perhaps linking to children's developmental outcomes. Next. And ANOVA was used to examine if there are any significant differences between the means of 3 or more groups. And we found teacher education is associated with ECERS scores. Specifically, postal comparisons indicated that the ECERS mean score for teachers with lower education levels was significantly less than teachers with higher education levels. And this analysis provides support for increasing the education level of classroom teachers. But in real life decision making, it is more complicated than this because we know that teachers with higher levels of education are attracted to different types of programs. Next. We used 2K factorial design to explore whether there was an association between program types and ECERS scores. And we found a significant difference in ECERS score between Head Start and non-Head Start programs and between state pre-K and non-state. Oh, I'm sorry. So in both cases, classrooms that were part of these programs have more requirements related to quality. For example, standards related to ratios, group size, teacher education, curriculum, and assessment. And they had higher ECERS score than classrooms that were not part of these programs. So the federal officials in the Head Start program can further see that the relatively high Head Start standards are associated with higher quality, particularly in comparison with non-pre-K programs. So these findings support efforts to raise the standards for programs that are neither state pre-K nor Head Start. Next. And we used machine learning-based hierarchical linear modeling to see the relations between classroom and teacher characteristics and ECERS scores. So the train test split procedure was used to estimate the performance of regression models. And the procedure involves taking a data set and dividing it into 2 subsets. So the first subset was used to fit the model, and the second subset was used to evaluate the model. And based on the bias variance trade-off, we found the optimized regression model, which is sufficiently complex. Next. So we found that ECERS scores were negatively associated with length of day, but an interaction effect suggested the negative association was less strong in classrooms with a greater proportion of children with disabilities. So this finding indicates that higher proportions of children with disabilities, in other words, more inclusive classrooms, may mitigate the negative association between classroom quality and length of day. Second, we found that higher teacher education levels were positively related to ECERS scores when early childhood classrooms were not located in elementary school buildings. And this indicates that classroom quality is related to teachers' education levels, especially when classrooms are in non-school settings. Next. And we used multi-level structural equation modeling to investigate how standards mediate the relation between Head Start program and classroom quality. The Head Start Act requires that each Head Start grant maintain at least 10% of all slots occupied by children with disabilities. As shown in the figure, Head Start classrooms had a higher proportion of children with disabilities than non-Head Start classrooms. So Head Start caused significant increases in the proportion of children with disabilities, which in turn were positively associated with the quality factors of indoor and room arrangement and learning activities. And these findings demonstrate that broad public policies in the form of standards and regulations are effective in achieving higher quality in early childhood programs. Next. Additionally, according to the Head Start Act, a program must ensure teachers implement developmentally appropriate schedules. Based on the statement, Head Start session options generally include a 7-hour or 9-hour day. As shown in the figure, Head Start classrooms had shorter length of day and operating hours than non-Head Start classrooms. In turn, there was an association between shorter length of day and higher quality scores for the ECERS factors, indoor and room arrangement, learning activities, and language and literacy. This finding indicates that there are real trade-offs between the longer operating hours to accommodate working families' needs and the program quality that children experience. So these trade-offs should be considered in terms of what they mean for the children of those families. Next. And we used item response theory to examine item difficulties. So the 5 most difficult items were blocks, nature science, math materials and activities, appropriate use of technology, and meals and snacks. And the 5 easiest items were peer interactions, staff-child interaction, transitions and waiting times, discipline, and supervision of gross motor. Overall, this indicates that the items within the interaction subscale are more likely to have a high score given the classroom's level of the latent quality. And the items in the learning activity subscale tend to be difficult for classrooms to achieve. And these items generally require both appropriate materials and appropriate teaching strategies in using the materials. Next. Finally, we know that populations of early childhood programs are often divided into subpopulations. However, these divisions may be inherently unobservable. For example, there may be types of classrooms that share characteristics in common, but these characteristics are not readily observable. Next. So we use a statistical technique called finding mixture models to model the probability of belonging to each unobserved group and to estimate distinct parameters of a regression model or distribution in each group. So the results revealed 7 classroom quality patterns based on ECERS-3 subscale scores. Group 1 is characterized by relatively high scores across all subscales except personal care routines. And Group 2 is characterized by low scores across all of subscales, while Group 3 had relatively higher scores in space and furnishings and personal care routines. And Group 4 had mediocre scores across subscales with scores ranging from 3 to 5. And groups 5, 6, and 7 were characterized by high scores in interactions and program structure and relatively lower scores in learning activities. However, Group 6 was characterized by somewhat lower scores in personal care routines, while Group 7 had generally low scores in space and furnishings. So I will now hand over to my colleague, Dr. Noreen Yazejian. She will discuss some applications and implications for the field of early care and education.
Thanks, Juan. So what does this all mean? We've presented a lot of numbers, a lot of data, some pictures. What does it mean for practice? So the descriptive analyses that Dari presented, if a state is considering setting up or changing its quality and improvement system, having data on the average scores and on the distribution of scores for a large sample of classrooms can help set cut points, for example. Models can be run to show the numbers and percentages of programs at the different levels. So you can see, what if we put our cut point here? What would this look like? So that you can make decisions using data. Analyses like the ones Juan showed us that show relations between aspects of early care and education programs, such as teacher education levels, length of day, and proportion of children with disabilities and quality levels, also have practice and policy implications and can guide decision-making around staffing and program setup. But as Juan noted, some findings may suggest trade-offs. For example, longer days may work better for parents, but be less optimal for children. So those things need to be taken into account. But in general, program developers and policymakers can partner with researchers to ensure that program regulations, governance, and funding ensure a robust early childhood system that meets children and families' needs. The cluster analysis that Juan showed there at the end is an example of how researchers can help with decisions. So I'm just going to show this picture again that Juan showed us. We saw distinct groups of programs, distinct groups of classrooms in these pictures. So cluster 2 had low scores across subscales, and clusters 3 and 4 had pretty mediocre scores. So the questions that program and researchers could ask, should standards be raised? Perhaps monitoring should be happening more frequently. With those kinds of clusters, it looks like too many classrooms may be scoring low and too many children's needs may not be being met. Cluster 1 had fairly high scores, except for routine care. And that's one area that can be pretty easy to improve with targeted supports. So that group might need just really specific supports around that one area. And then many of the classrooms in these clusters show low scores on the activity subscales. And that one's important for children's outcomes. So perhaps across the board, more technical assistance and professional development should focus on activities. And that would include both in-service and pre-service trainings. So some special issues, we often get asked, what is the norm on the ECERS? What's the national average? And the answer is that there is not a national norm or a national average. This large scale validation study that we've shown today of the ECERS-3 scores included 3 states. It had a high number of classrooms, and it showed an overall average of 3.63. So that can be kind of a benchmark, but again, it's not a national norm or a national average. International uses, more than 10 official translations exist. We have an international community of researchers that meets regularly to share learnings across cultures. In fact, we hope to meet in person in April, if willing. So that's another consideration, a special issue. Regarding training and reliability, the level of training and reliability needed among users really depends on the use of the scale and on the scores. So the scale can and has been used in high stakes settings. So with QRIS systems with tiered reimbursements, and high quality training and vigilance regarding reliability must be maintained in those situations. When the scales are used as a self-assessment tool or for continuous improvement, it may be that less rigor is needed as long as one accepts that the scores may have error. Finally, with health and safety, COVID-19 highlighted the issues of health and safety in all settings, health issues. More research is needed on health and safety aspects of early care and education environments. So we hope that's an area where there's more work done. So special populations, as Dick mentioned, focus group recommendations during the development of the ECERS-3, there were focus groups conducted. And the participants in those focus groups downplayed the need for additional items or a new subscale related to children with disabilities. Providing high quality for children with disabilities cuts across the full spectrum of quality represented by the ECERS, and any needs beyond global quality should be addressed with separate instruments, was the recommendation of those focus groups. However, we are mindful that while we are concerned about the development of all children and have a focus on all aspects of global quality, being committed to equity means that we may need to focus on children with greater needs in order to ensure that all children thrive. The ECERS has been used widely by observers of various races and ethnicities, in classrooms taught by teachers of various races, and in environments serving children of various races and ethnicities. Current available evidence suggests that the ECERS demonstrates comparably high levels of reliability and validity for white, Black, and Latino, Latina, Hispanic children. Nevertheless, the scales were written by people who brought their own cultural values to the work, and more work is needed to examine the extent to which the measure is fair and minimizes biases and observations. So future directions. Analyses can continue with ECERS-3 scores to explore alternative structures. For example, Dick mentioned all those indicators that go into the items that go into the subscales. it may be that those indicators group together in interesting ways that tell us things about quality. So more work on looking at different structures could be of interest. I have funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation with co-principal investigator Ioma Aruka to interrogate the ECERS-3 regarding cultural responsivity and bias. So these analyses will inform future versions of the ECERS. And then special features of classrooms can be examined through ECERS extensions. Extensions are shorter scales that focus on specific areas or features. For example, we have international colleagues who are currently working on extensions that explore creativity and an extension that explores play. International uses of the scales grow and continue to expand, and we are pleased to support this growth. I know the original authors really enjoy participating in that international community of ECERS users, and we hope that continues. Finally, future directions should continue to examine what aspects of quality are related to children's outcomes, including outcomes that perhaps have not typically been considered, such as creativity or children's agency. And with that, I am going to open it up for questions. So if you will put your questions in the chat, we can answer those. All right, I think we've got a few. I'm sorry, I'm gonna scroll back here. Okay, somebody asked about the citation for this. The book that we're presenting on today right now is the citation. I think Emily mentioned at the beginning that you can order the book and a link will be coming out afterwards. So it's the book right now is the citation for this information that we're presenting today. I can't see people's names, but oh, here we go. Kate McCrimmon is asking what other countries use this. Dick, did you want to try to answer that? Dick has a poster behind him. I know you can't see it, but it's a picture of all the different versions. So he might have to turn around.
It's back there. So yeah, I'll say a few words. The scales have certainly been used in all of the English-speaking countries of the world. So here, Canada, Great Britain, and Australia, New Zealand, and then it's been translated. Noreen mentioned 10. There are 10 currently active versions now, but I think it's actually been published. One version or another has been published in about 20 countries, and additional ones have been done just for research purposes in additional countries. But those countries range from China to Korea to in the East, in Russia, in Ukraine, in it's being used some now in Kazakhstan, and then pretty much all of the European countries have used the scales. In the Scandinavian countries all have used it. Germany, the rest of Northern Europe has used it. In Southern Europe, a good bit of use there. Greece, Italy, Spain, and Portugal all have used it. It's been being used now in Turkey in various situations in Turkey. Fewer uses in Africa, I would say, but pretty much all of the other populated parts of the world it's been used in pretty much all of those. So it's very widely used. We have about, just to continue that, we have about 100 people who have participated in our ECERS International Work Group. And as Noreen mentioned, that's a working group that helps, is a place where we can each present what we're doing in our individual countries with the scales and compare that with other people and what they're doing in their countries. and to get new ideas for ourselves about directions we ought to move.
Okay, so we have a question. I'm just trying to go in order here, but they keep adding in, so I keep losing my place. So excuse me for a moment. Okay, somebody asked if there was research on ECERS-3 scores with children's performance. And the large validation study that that we described, which was led by Diane Early, did look at ECERS-3 scores and children's outcomes, and found some modest associations. So yes, there's a wide body of literature showing that classroom quality measures like the ECERS-3 and children's outcomes are related. Those relationships have typically been pretty modest, but yes, there are associations there. Mary Shaw asks if classes with higher rates of inclusion of children with disabilities tended to score higher or lower on the ECERS. Juan, did you want to answer that? Oh, we can't hear you, Juan.
Oh, yeah. Sure. So the proportion of children with disabilities tend to increase the quality factors such as indoor space and arrangement and learning activities.
Yeah, so more higher quality there. Sarah asks if there's a plan to do more with multi-language learners. This certainly is a growing population of children in our country, and it's something we need to look at more carefully. The scales have been translated into these different languages, like Dick was just saying. So you can use this, the scale. You can go into a classroom, Spanish speakers, for example, and use a Spanish version of the scale if you want. We always would recommend that if you're going into a Spanish classroom, that you are bilingual, that you understand Spanish. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard to score. And I do think that happens sometimes, that English assessors go in. So that's something we wouldn't encourage. Let's see. The next question, is there a likelihood of an extension that measures culturally responsive pedagogy or affirming practices for children of color? The work that Ioma and I are doing with funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is looking at the ECERS-3 with an equity and culturally responsivity as a lens to see what might be missing. The goal of that study is to come up with some recommendations to improve the ECERS-3, whether that will be an extension, whether it will be, pairing with another measure, whether it will be extensive changes to the ECERS-3. I don't know right now because we haven't done the study yet, but it is something we are looking at. So I appreciate that question. Okay, let's see, I better hurry up here. All right, Sandra Hess is saying that she has mentored teachers with the ECERS-3 and has found that there's a lot of emphasis with the teachers on the score and less on the indicators and purpose. And I'm just looking because she's put another comment in. She's found that when she looks at change practices on the reason behind the indicators, that might, more work might be done with interpreting these practices. Yeah, I think, trying to get teachers, I think, to understand, what Dick did at the beginning. Why are we doing this? Understanding the thinking behind the indicators, why it's important, is important and can be more effective than just focusing on a score. I totally agree with that comment. All right, Megan Schulter is asking, is there information in the book about the clusters of classrooms that show information about the variables for each cluster? Okay, so teacher education, inclusion of children, that would help states think about how they might use strategies to support improvement. So I think what Megan is asking about is something that our author group talked about as it would be a really important next step, is to look at, so we know that there's clusters that have particular scoring profiles. How are those clusters related to some of the other variables? And we did not do that for this book, and Juan can correct me if I'm wrong, because he did these complicated analyses. But we talked about in our author group that that would be a really important next step, or another thing for folks to look at.
So I'd make a couple of comments about that. This is Dick. You notice if you remember from looking at that chart, that there are about 6% of the programs that scored in the high range. They're doing well on almost everything. And that it's not too hard for people in the field to know which classrooms those are. That they're pretty evident when you go out into the field. And the idea there is that the thing we see that's missing in those is maybe work on routine care issues. Often we find that it's actually very hard for programs to score high on everything, because there's so many things you need to do within early childhood education. But we'd say those people who are in that first group are doing really well. And then there's the one, this was maybe the fifth one, that where people are doing not well on most anything. And that's the most problematic group. And I was a state administrator for child care for a year on leave from UNC. And we tried to target those that were at the very bottom of the scale by focusing on, we visited them more often, we increased surveillance on them more often, we tried to target interventions to them, but we also looked very careful at other measures. Like we found those that scored at the very bottom tended to have more complaints from parents, more issues around child abuse and neglect in those centers. And at some point, you have to say, is this a program that should continue to operate? And those were very hard decisions. But over the years in North Carolina, we have drastically reduced the number of programs that are in that category through those two kinds of methods, by helping them a whole lot and by dealing with the ones that are the very worst cases and discouraging them from continuing, or actually sometimes going to court to close them. So, and then the others give you this variation, and you do need to go in and look. I think one thing I've mentioned that maybe I don't remember you mentioning, is that in those charts, each of those lines is one classroom. So there are 1,300 lines in those 8 different groups. So just for your information, so it gives you an idea that this is how programs score overall.
Okay, Andrea Fernandez is asking if the item requirements are different in the ECERS-3 than the ECERS-R, and the answer is yes. The ECERS-3 was a revision to the ECERS-R, and there's some differences. I don't know, Dick, if you can summarize those quickly. I know less of a focus on, detailed hand washing and toileting, and more of a focus on how materials are used versus just, having the materials. It's really how they're used with the children and teacher-child interactions.
Yeah, I think in general, over time, we've moved away from counting things to more general observations of how things are going. And with hand washing, we did make some significant changes in the health and care routines that we thought would raise the scores on those. And they did a little bit. That is, now people who are scoring a little higher on the personal care routines than they were in ECERS-R. And we did that by, we looked at all of the indicators that we had on personal care routines, and we tried to say, why are so many people not moving up the scale? And part of it was that our definitions of complying with hand washing routines was probably more strict than we could, was appropriate. And so we tried to change that to allow for variations over time, because we weren't getting enough variation in scores on those items to be able to help us point to what needed to be changed. So those scored a little higher. The materials ones, as you said, we've gotten a little more general in our responses to that, with less emphasis on counting materials and more emphasis on how the materials are used. I think those are main things that we did.
Okay. Catherine wanted us to talk again about the differences in quality between longer day programs and shorter. And she says longer day programs tend to have lower quality. And that is correct. That is what we saw. That was the association we saw. Let's see.
That's something we've seen in other studies as well, is that programs with very long days tend to score lower. It's very hard to keep up the quality over a 12-hour day. And that's something states need to consider when they think about licensing rules and regulations, about how to deal with that issue, about helping programs learn how to schedule staff to more effectively, whether you means you break the day into two big components, kind of a standard kind of school length part of the day at the beginning of the day, and an after school kind of view at the end of the day. But anyway, it's very hard to do. These things, I'll just add there that these things are all interconnected. That's the point from our early slides, is that all of these things are interconnected with one another. And so you have to look at the big picture and interpret what you're finding in terms of what your overall objectives are and what things you can do to make changes in your state.
Yes, and that kind of goes to Elizabeth's question about Head Start, whether differences in funding and supports were taken into account. And in our analyses, we've just looked at Head Start as a whole, which we know has better ratios, has higher education levels. You know, there are some things there, but we didn't look at each of those things separately. So that is a good point, that, you know, when you're looking at data like this, there are some things that are part of the systems of care that are different. Let's see, Adriana is asking, I think she's asking if in international uses, if the ECERS is used like it is, I think Adriana's in North Carolina, where classrooms are given a score as part of quality, part of licensing here in North Carolina. She's wondering, I think, if it's used that way internationally. And I can say in our international communities that we interact with, it's really a community of researchers. So we're researchers who use the scales to look at quality and children's outcomes and things like that. So I don't know, Dick, if you have more to say about how the scales are used in other countries beyond, you know, what we know in terms of research.
We have colleagues in England and Britain who have used the scales in a couple of ways. they have done what are called, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the word. They have done status checks on the status of programs for local authorities. Local authorities they're like county governments. The local authorities there fund a lot of the early childcare and early education in Britain, and they've worked with the local authorities to assess the practices that are happening in their programs, more for overall program improvement in a little different way than we do here. They've also tested theories about in ways of intervening in programs to see what's the most effective means of intervening in programs. In Russia, they've used the scales to help the government figure out how well practice is going in programs in Russia. Ukraine has used the scales in looking at their programs. They gave copies of the scales to every kindergarten teacher. Well, for them, kindergarten is for 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, but they gave copies of the scale to every kindergarten teacher in Ukraine. Now, I don't know what's happened since the war began there, but I do know they're continuing to work with teachers and train teachers during the war there. What's happened in Russia, I just don't know. Trying to think where else. In Brazil, they've used the scales in large-scale studies of pre-K programs as the country was increasing its involvement with pre-kindergarten programs to help guide that expansion program. Oh gosh. What they've been used in some countries, less well-developed countries, to help them as they think about much more basic issues, the health and care routines that are going on, the adequacy of services to keep children safe, as assessing those kinds of issues. And others have systems like ours, where their programs are being trained and using this as an evaluation of the effectiveness of the training. So those kinds of things people are doing.
Okay, let's see. We got a couple more questions. Oh,
I wanted to address one. You may have done this already and I missed it, Noreen, but one that Adriana asked about, is the book used as a guide or classroom or evaluated and graded like an NC? The book itself is a guide for programs. It's not something, it's to help people figure out how to use the scale and to use the findings from use of the scale. The first part of the book, which is the more introductory that I talked about in the beginning, the theories of change, the theories of how children learn, and that part would be relevant to anyone. So it could be used with teachers in classes who are studying early childhood development, or they can be used by people who are trying to interpret the findings of research that they've done or evaluation that they've done. But none of them are it's not designed to grade programs or offer new ways of evaluating them. It's different ways of looking at the data.
Okay, let's see. Kate McCrimmon is asking if we'll be including Indigenous perspectives in future versions. And I think that is a goal of looking at equity issues in terms of, the values that go into the items and, making sure that we do have multiple perspectives. So I think future versions will take a closer look at that for sure.
There are some cases where in indigenous settings, there are efforts to try to develop supplemental scales for indigenous populations and blend that with the scales using the environment rating scales instruments. I think Oregon has a practice working on that that seems to be quite successful. But yeah. We always keep looking at these things because we learn from these other populations in both the US and in other countries that help us understand better about how we work with children.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm aware that we are over time. So I just want to thank everybody for joining today, and we look forward to continuing our journey with you of improving classroom quality measurement. Thank you, everyone.